Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. It's that time again. We've got a new set in Standard, and it's time for me to update the Deck Building Toolbox series. As always, we start with Colorless and Land, because these are the cards that can go into any deck you create. Any deck can add a land to it with a minimum of muss and fuss. Any deck can play a colorless card. Now this set is a little bit special in that there are a lot of disguise creatures. And any of the disguise creatures you could consider a 2/2 ward for 3 colorless. And they flip up for various costs. Some of them are hybrid colors, so you can easily play them in a deck that can only access one of those colors of mana. But we're not going to think of those as colorless cards. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the colorless and lands. They're a pretty small section for Murders at Karlov Manor. First up, we've got Thinking Cap. This is just a common. And the only constructed application that I can really see for it would be in a detective stack. Now, in a detective stack, it might be better than it looks. I don't know that you want to run 4 copies of this, but a little piece of equipment that you get down early, you can just shuffle it around on the board as needed to give +1/+2. It's actually a more significant boost than you might think. If any of you out there have run mono red with the rabbit battery, the little piece of equipment that's also a 1/1 with haste, you can move it for 1 red to give something +1/+1 in haste. If any of you out there have tried mono red with rabbit battery, then you know rabbit battery is actually pretty useful, right? You can move it around onto your other creatures to get past blockers that would normally be too big for them. And then those same rabbits survive board sweepers, right? Because they were equipment at the time, so they turned back into a rabbit. This one doesn't do that, but it does equip around for just 1 mana. And the 2 toughness definitely can matter because of decks like mono red. I don't think it's terrible if you're playing a detective stack, but that's the only place I can think of for it. And I don't know if it's good enough even there. Case of the Shattered Pact, I am going to go ahead and craft my 4th copy of this one. Now that's not to say that you need this card, because you don't really. In fact, I'll show you why. So if you like Case of the Shattered Pact, right? Now, for its first mode, what it initially does, it's a lot like the lesson from Strixhaven, right? That found a land and you gain 2 life. That card could be fetched with other things that found a lesson, though. That's not the case with this card. This one, if you have 5 colors among permanents you control, such as with the Leyline of the Guild Pact, for example, then you can solve this, and then a creature you control gains flying, double strike, and vigilance, which is pretty great. But unless you're building the deck to actually turn this case on, then it's not that exciting. If you're just using it as a colorless way to go fetch a land and have a permanent left over, I have another card you might like. So there's this card you may have forgotten about from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty called Ecologist's Terrarium. And this is a 2 mana artifact that does much the same thing as that case. On the CTBs, search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it in your hand, shuffle, and then the extra text on this card is you can pay 2, tap, and sack it at sorcery speed to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. That's pretty low impact. Most of the time you're going to have something better to do than put a +1 counter on at sorcery speed. But I will say that it's much, much easier to use this card for its extra text than the other one we just looked at. Right? This one just wants you to have 2 mana available at sorcery speed to get a +1 counter. Doesn't make a big board impact, but it doesn't ask much of you either. And it's an artifact instead of an enchantment, which there are pluses and minuses both ways. There's an enchantment deck in Standard, right? But there are also a lot of artifact decks in Standard. There's, Rakdos Anvil, which this is a pretty good thing to sack to the Anvil if you're into that. You could also play this into the white deck that's running Thousand Hammer Smithy, and this would let you hit your land drops and stuff. This would be fine in that deck too. I'm not saying it's great in any of those decks, but it's an option. It's a very similar 2 colorless mana card that finds you a basic land. Or there's Case of the Shattered Pact, which does the same thing, leaves you with an enchantment case instead of an artifact. And then if you want the rest of the text on this card, you gotta have 5 colors among permanents you control. That sounds like a very specific, very narrow deck to build, like you're trying to build a Leyline of the Guild Pact deck. You can play it for its other qualities, and I think it's like enough of a consideration. I'm going to craft my 4th copy. Just in case it's what I might want as an enchantment slot in a deck. But really, you can kind of almost do better with what we've already got in Standard. Next up is Cryptex, and this one lives up to its name. This one is most assuredly a puzzle, a conundrum. So it's a 2-mana mana rock, right? If you cut through the red tape and you really look at what this thing does, it is a 2-mana mana rock that makes mana of any color. Now, that would be great. Everyone would play it, except that every time you use it, you have to have 3 converted mana cost of cards in your graveyard. And that could be an issue. Now maybe you've got a self-mill deck, and maybe your self-mill is just piling all kinds of stuff into the graveyard, in which case, sure, you can probably turn on the Cryptex. But does that mean that Cryptex is a card that your deck wants? Do you want the Cryptex in that deck, or do you just want to hit a critical mass of stuff in your graveyard that you don't want to exile because you're trying to cast Squirming Emergence? And if you're exiling cards with Cryptex, you're taking away from Squirming Emergence. Or you're eating stuff you could have been reanimating. Yeah, maybe you put so many things into the graveyard that doesn't even matter, and you're able to use the mana ramp from Cryptex. But those decks don't actually need much mana ramp. They just need to hit the right combo pieces to be able to cast the Squirming Emergence, whether it's from their hand or from their graveyard. And the difference between, being at like 3 mana and being at 6 mana is not that big of a deal in that deck. So then is there some other deck in Standard that wants Cryptex? Maybe something that's using some of the cards that were made in this set, that make detectives or plants when cards are leaving your graveyard. I don't know. I cannot recommend that you craft this card. I don't know if it does anything. And to get the second part of the card, where you can sacrifice it to surveil 3 and draw 3 cards, which admittedly is a strong line of text, right? You get to fill up the graveyard, set the top of your library with what you want, then you draw 3. All of that's great, but you have to have 5 unlock counters on this thing, which means at a minimum that you have collected evidence across 5 different turns, exiling a minimum of 15 converted mana cost of cards out of your graveyard. And that might just be 5 turns and 5 cards. The other possibility is that you get a counter onto this thing and you start proliferating. That's a possibility, right? You could play this in a proliferate deck, and as long as you get a counter on it, then you could build up to the sacrifice. But if you're not collecting evidence, you're not making mana with it in the meantime. So I don't know how good that would be there either. By Buyer beware. Gravestone Strider, this is fantastic for limited, for making, 3, 4, 5 color decks in limited. In constructed, you don't need it. Basically, the mana bases in constructed are strong enough that you might have to run some tap lands if you have a small collection. But you should be able to make the mana that you need without having to use the Gravestone Strider. If you don't want to rely on a creature to do it, there's even other mana filters that we have access to. Collector's Vault almost counts as a mana filter. You can turn 2 mana into a treasure token, which, puts you down 1 mana, but you also get to draw and discard at the same time. This is a pretty great card. Energy Refractor is an expensive way to do this kind of filtration. It does draw you a card, but there's an even better card than Energy Refractor. There's Mystic Skull. This filters 1 mana into 1 mana of any color. It's a better rate. It can turn into a 5/6 that makes all of your lands have fixed mana. I'd argue there's even a better card than this one. Prophetic Prism. This one draws you a card and filters 1 mana into 1 mana of any color. Pretty great. Also, there's Salvaged Mana Worker, which is mostly the same card. Gravestone Strider is just slightly better, but as you can see, we have a lot of options at budget options for filtering your mana. So, this one doesn't draw you a card, it's just a body on the field. Makes it pretty vulnerable to the opponent's removal. I would say if you're doing a budget, 4 or 5 color deck, you don't have access to a good mana base yet, having to use a lot of tap lands, some of those mana filtering cards that draw you a card when they come down are probably going to be better for you. Or even like the case of the Shattered Pact on the Ecologist Terrarium might be better for you. Sanitation Automaton. Again, this is like a limited card. And in limited, it's fine. It blocks disguised creatures. It's relatively aggressive. The Surveil is good. Can help dig you to the cards that you need. Can put things in the graveyard. It's just not got the chops for constructed, really. Magnifying Glass is a little bit interesting for a couple of reasons. Oh, Thinking Cap 2, actually. So there is a blue card that once we get to the section on blue, much later, is probably not a good enough card for constructed, but it's a large flying creature that searches your library for a Thinking Cap and or a Magnifying Glass. Maybe you can get them out of your graveyard in your hand, too. Puts them on the battlefield for you. So that's something neat that refers to both of these cards. Now again, that blue flyer is something like a 4/3 for 6. I don't think it's really going to see much constructed play, but it's interesting, and it refers to these 2 cards. Now this card is not wholly unplayable, it is a mana rock, right? So if you play this on 3, you are ramping mana. It comes in untapped. So if you have something to do with the mana, if it lines up right, then you can use that mana right away. So for example, on turn 5, you play a Magnifying Glass, then you have another 3 mana to do another 3-drop. All of that's fine. Not exciting or anything, there are better mana rocks in Standard. Just off the top of my head, there's like the Celestus, that taps for mana of any color and lets you draw and discard and gain life. Putting 1 copy of the Ehrencrag in your deck is a better mana rock. It's legendary, but if you just put 1 copy in, then you've got something that produces Colorless for just 2 mana instead of 3 mana. And generally that's much more valuable than the 4 and tap to investigate. So 1 copy of Ehrencrag is just immediately better. Honored Heirloom makes any color of mana, and it can exile things from graveyards. Network Terminal makes any color of mana, and you can tap other untapped artifacts to draw and discard, so this can loot, as long as you have another artifact. Relic of Legends can be quite powerful. It taps to make a mana of any color. It can also just tap an untapped legendary creature you control to make 1 mana of any color. And they can have Summoning Sickness. right? This is just an ability of the Relic of Legends that just taps them. So if you have a Legends deck, or a deck with any Legends in it at all to speak of, this could be ramping you much more than just 1 mana. And that makes it far more powerful in a deck that can turn that part of it on. Staff of Completion. You can pay 2 life to make a mana of any color, and it also has 3 other modes plus untapping. Now untapping doesn't help for making mana, obviously, because that costs 5 mana. But it can destroy a permanent you own, it can proliferate, which I often find is much better than you might think, and you can just tap and pay 4 life to draw a card. I think a one-of copy of Staff of Completion is just a fantastic inclusion for a whole bunch of different decks. Probably a little better in best of 3. We've got a pretty aggressive meta right now in best of 1. I still love this card, though. I still think it's a great inclusion into just about any deck, especially if you have anything you want to proliferate. And we have the Sunbird standard. Makes mana of any color, and then it can craft to turn into like a giant bird construct, which itself taps for yet more mana. There's the Celestis if you haven't seen it. Now, all of that being said, I am not telling you Magnifying Glass is useless. If you are on a budget, you're just kind of starting up your account, you're looking for cards for some kind of a rampy, control-y type of deck where you're answering the board, and you'd like things that get you ahead on mana, so you can cast your, 5 mana board sweepers and whatnot on time. And you'd also like a source of recursive card advantage for a, go long kind of control deck. Something you can even use at the end of the opponent's turn, right? You can do this with a Magnifying Glass. It is not a useless card. There are better cards in Standard, but if you're early on, I think this card would be fine. You could also experiment with the blue flying creature that references Magnifying Glass and Thinking Cap. We're not on the blue section yet, but just for reference, it's Agency Outfitter. Agency Outfitter searches your graveyard, hand, and/or library for a card named Magnifying Glass and/or a card named Thinking Cap, put them on the battlefield, and shuffle. So, this is the card that references them, but we're not talking about blue yet. Alright, Lumbering Laundry. This is a limited card. It's actually pretty forgettable in limited, but it's fine. Alright, sometimes a 4/5 for 5 stabilizes the board, just kind of what you need. You can flip it up for 5 mana, can blow out a combat step, right, just as a big, dumb disguise creature. And in limited, the ability to look at face-down creatures you don't control could give you some information that's pretty useful. In constructed play, I don't think there's going to be that many face-down creatures, and a lot of the time, as you get to know those decks that run some face-down creatures, I think it's likely that you're going to be able to guess what it is, right? And say, oh, that's the angel that exiles things, or oh, that's the 3/2 guy that flips up and gets rid of a permanent and gives you like a detective or whatever. So in Constructed, I think there's not going to be widespread adoption of disguise creatures. And this card is just not, it's just below rate, all the way around. So I cannot imagine this card really seeing any Constructed play. Magnetic Snuffler is a little bit interesting. So when this one ETBs, you return an equipment card from your graveyard to the battlefield and you attach it to the Magnetic Snuffler. Now if we had something like Colossus Hammer in Standard, then this could be interesting. I believe there's also like a 5 mana white card. I forget her name. That can reanimate like an equipment or an aura to the battlefield and attach it to her. Well, we have a backup effect, and this one is just an uncommon, so you could do it on a budget. And if you really like the concept of that deck, then you could double up on the effect and have more than 4 copies at 5 mana. If you choose. The other text on this card is whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Magnetic Snuffler. So again, this plays well into an artifact deck, and treasure tokens, for example, could boost the Magnetic Snuffler to a gigantic size. Or if you're like in an Anvil deck or something, 5 mana is kind of a lot to pay for a card in the Anvil deck. But that being said, this card is not useless. If you're trying to cobble together an artifact deck, and you don't have a deep collection yet, you could do worse than a Magnetic Snuffler. And there's an outside possibility of doing something with this with an equipment deck. Now, I don't think it's good enough to see play, but a lot of these cards I was just forced to write off as being utterly unplayable under any circumstance whatsoever. Right, like Gravestone Strider just has better options in Standard, basically. Automaton, better options. Lumbering Laundry, better options. Thinking Cap and the Magnifying Glass, mostly interesting because they can be fetched out with a blue flyer. This one has a little bit of potential for deck building. And it's just an uncommon. Alright, we're going to move on to the lands. So you're going to get the basics for free. There is a cycle of these tap lands. They're rare. They have 2 basic land types. So there are some cards that can fetch these cards because they have a basic land type, but they do not count as a basic land. So, for example, if someone uses Boseiju, they channel it to destroy like one of your non-basics or an artifact or enchantment, Boseiju actually lets you fetch a land with a basic land type. And so you could fetch one of these out to get a free Surveil. They make 2 colors of mana. You get a free Surveil that can fill the graveyard, can smooth out your draws in the early game. They're better than a Scry. Now, does that make them strong enough to see play? A little bit. I think, you don't necessarily run 4 copies in a deck, but you might run some number. Now, I'm not a big advocate of going out of one's way to craft mana-fixing lands. I don't love using my wild cards that way, but I don't have a lot of things to use my wild cards on for colorless and lands this go-around. So, Cryptex seems really weird. I don't want to spend any wild cards on Cryptex, so I think I'm going to end up spending my wild cards over here in the land section. I always like to use 3 rares and 1 mythic, approximately, for each of the sections I do in the Deck Building Toolbox series. And that's because I want you to know I put my money where my mouth is. Alright, so I've got 2 of these. I do not have any Thundering Falls, so that would be a craft consideration. Underground Mortuary. I am definitely interested in some green-black decks. I would like to have some copies of this land. And I think Surveil goes very well with the themes of green-black decks. So I'll probably be crafting at least 1 or 2 of these. I don't have any Elegant Parlor, but red-white doesn't like tap lands very much. It tends to be a more aggressive build. Alright, Branch of V2 Ghazi. I'm going to go ahead and craft a copy of this. This one is interesting to me, not because it's especially powerful, but because the cost of running it in your deck is pretty low. So you run a colorless land that comes in untapped. That is a bit of a cost, but it's not much of a cost. It's pretty easy to build a stable, solid mana base in Constructed these days. And if you have like additional mana fixing, you know, like you're a green deck or you've got artifacts that are tapping for any color, things like that, then it just becomes kind of a non-issue for the most part. And this has the dual functionality of being playable as a creature. And oddly enough, when you play it as a creature, it can color fix your mana. Right? When you flip it up for the disguise cost, it gives you back 2 mana of any one color that you don't lose until end of turn. So oddly enough, it can help you fix your mana, not ramp, but just fix it into the right color. You can also, you know, just block something and flip this up, and as long as the thing it's blocking doesn't have trample, it got stopped. You didn't lose anything in the process other than the mana. It's kind of neat. You just run it in your mana base, and you have additional, admittedly bad, creatures that you can play in your deck. And they're kind of tricky if you flip them up. And I like that about the Branch of Vitu-Ghazi. I don't think it's impossible that this could have real constructed application. Escape Tunnel. There is no reason not to craft 4 of this if you had any reason at all to ever use Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse, both of which are actually legal in Standard at this very moment. So is Escape Tunnel, and Escape Tunnel is just better. Now, arguably, the lands that fetch 3 different types of basics from Streets of New Capenna might be a touch better than this one if what you want is something that immediately sacrifices itself when it comes in. It also gains you a life. So that at least is a point of consideration. But Escape Tunnel's awfully good. You can sacrifice it in its second mode to make a creature with power 2 or less unblockable for 1 turn. And yeah, I could see that easily being a way to win the game. You could maybe run a one-of copy of this in like a poison deck. You wouldn't want a bunch of these in a poison deck because you want to hit your untapped mana in the early turns. But if you got your one-of Escape Tunnel, you can just drop it down and surprise, something is unblockable. Maybe a double strike toxic creature. I could imagine this card seeing play in Standard, is what I'm saying. Public Thoroughfare. This is slow. Slow as can be. But it's not as bad if you have some artifacts. Right? If you have some artifacts, like token artifacts or whatever, then when this ETBs, instead of tapping a land, you can tap an artifact. And it's just like playing any normal tap land, except this one makes all 5 colors of mana. I could see using this card in Constructed. I know it looks incredibly slow, and it is. But as long as you're going to be sweeping the board and otherwise dealing with the situation, and especially if you're in a deck that can make little token artifacts or throwaway artifacts like Ecologist Terrarium and stuff, then the cost of playing this is not that high. And it's pretty reasonable. It's super slow, and I think if you have a good filled out collection, you're not going to use this card, but if you're in the early days of the game, and you're looking for a good budget option to cobble together a, 3, 4, 5 color deck, yeah, this is a common. This is a common, and it's worth your time to figure out how to get through the loopholes to use this card, because it'll make your mana run smoothly for your deck. I think for a new player who's trying to, get their feet under them and they want to make a multicolor deck early, which is hard to do, then this is a good common land that's going to let you do that. And for that reason, I think it could absolutely see play, especially for a new player. Scene of the Crime. This one is just an uncommon. I think I'm going to go ahead and craft my 4th copy. So the problem with this is that ETB's tapped, and that is a cost. It makes colorless. It can make a mana of any color if you tap an untapped creature you control. The creature can have summoning sickness, right? That part doesn't matter. So as long as you have any creature out, then this can make mana of any color. And again, that could make it useful in a multicolor deck for a new player. As long as you can get down, I don't know, an artifact creature, something cheap and early to be able to turn on the mana on this. You can also pay to sacrifice this thing to draw a card. Now, there's actually a better land in Standard, potentially, for drawing cards. Roadside Reliquary is a land that's uncommon from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. This one you can pay to, tap, and sack it. You draw a card if you control an artifact. You also draw a card if you control an enchantment. Now, this one technically costs more mana to use. Right? It's 3 total because you have to pay 2 and tap this thing. And sometimes you're only going to draw 1 card with it because you don't have both permanent types. But it's not difficult at all to make a deck in Standard that plays both artifacts and enchantments, especially like token artifacts and stuff. So very often you can run Roadside Reliquary and it will draw you 2 cards. And that is a big upside. Now, Scene of the Crime, by comparison, it comes in tapped, but once you've got it in play, it's much cheaper to activate, right, than Roadside Reliquary. Because you can tap the scene itself for a colorless to help pay for the 2, because you don't have to tap and sack the scene with the pay 2. So it can make one of the 2 mana that's needed to draw the card. So, Scene of the Crime is a much easier to use sack land. It has one other wrinkle as a card, and that is that it is an artifact land. There are some decks where that could be an upside for you. It could be a benefit, like Rakdos Anvil and such. You get another artifact that you can just run in the mana base. That's kind of cool. It could also be a detriment if the opponent's able to, destroy target artifact. Then they've got a new easy target that blows up one of your lands. And that's bad. I still find it interesting, so I'm going to go ahead and craft the 4th copy. I think it could have some play in Standard. Alright, so that brings us to the end of Colorless and Lands. I like having a filled out collection, so I'm actually going to craft a Thundering Falls, an Underground Mortuary, and an Elegant Parlor. And that way, my total collection for one-ofs gets more completed. In terms of the cards I actually want for building decks, I'd like more copies of Underground Mortuary. But for now, I'm just going to craft those, and the uncommons that I didn't have 4 of yet. The Scene of the Crime, Branch of Vitu-Ghazi, and Case of the Shattered Pact. Cryptex. I'll just see if I get more copies of this from opening packs or something. Here we go. Alright. Got some shiny new cards here. Join me next time. I'll be starting at white, like monocolor white. We'll go through white, blue, black, red, green. Eventually we will end at multicolor. The reason we end at multicolor is because they are the cards that have the most stringent requirements in terms of deck building. So we leave multicolor for last because they're the toughest tools to use in the toolbox, even though they're very powerful cards. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.